Welcome to Contemporary Art Tasmania. I'm Kylie Johnson. We're on the land of the Muhanina people. So tonight we're here for Embraced in the Loving Arms of an Algorithm, version 1.1. And Amy what was it, yesterday that you arrived from the UK, Amy?
No, the day before.
The day before. So,
got to Hobart yesterday.
And John's also just, you flew in yesterday from New Zealand?
Yeah.
Right. So we'll see how it rolls. So Amy has been working with Jon through the CAT Curatorial Mentorship, and I think that started in about October last year. And this is probably the first time that you guys have come together in the real. And so Jon Smeathers is a composer, sound and installation artist based in Nipaluna, Hobart. Jon has exhibited and performed both internationally and across Australia. His work taps into the potential of algorithmic displacement, codecs and remix culture to enable a reimagination of one's spectral and rhythmic currents. And Amy, welcome to Nipaluna, Hobart.
Thank you.
So Amy is a writer and theorist, best known for her work with the techno-materialist trans-feminist collective Laboria Cubanonics, whose xenofeminism, a politics for alienation, has been translated into, I've got written down here 17 languages, which I think is really impressive, but I think you said it was up to 25.
No, it was 18, I checked.
Oh, okay.
But they're all translations by people who've offered to translate it.
That's right, yeah. She's published widely in contemporary art journals and magazines, and her poetry and performance work has been included in exhibitions such as the 20th Biennale of Sydney, London's Barbican Centre's AI More Than Human, and the 2021 Athens Biennale. She's the editor and translator for UK-based publisher and arts organisation Ergonomics. And tonight we're just going to have a conversation, and we might roll into a few questions later, but we'll just see how that goes. Thank you, Amy and Jon.
Thank you. Thanks for all coming. So nice to have such a lovely group of humans here. Especially some of those that have travelled long distances, so greatly appreciate that. I just want to start today just by recognising CAT and all their support that they've given for this project, especially for Kylie for all her work in this project and a lot of trust and commitment to being able to enable an arts practice that is pretty crazy, weird, very unknown and speculative. And for a gallery to have that kind of trust is very important for the arts. So yes, thank you, Kat, on here. And yeah, also just thank you to Amy for coming all the way here. So special
Thanks
to
for
have
inviting
you.
me.
Yeah, it's so nice. So today I just thought we'd have a little conversation, just talking around the project, around some of the ideas. We'll just see where it goes. Nothing's really planned or anything like that. But just as a way to kind of share some of the ideas in where this project, this curatorial project is going, where it's leading to, and also some of the undercurrents of maybe previous works of ours as well. So I thought rather than diving straight into the project, we'd initially kind of unpack some of the ideas surrounding algorithmic culture and what that might look like outside of maybe kind of current normality of thinking about algorithms as just AI and thinking it in a very different space and what that can look like. So to begin this kind of conversation, I kind of wanted to open up some of the ideas that were presented in your Xenofeminist manifestation, which is such a beautiful, amazing piece of writing that has sparked so much interest into this project for me. And just, I guess I'm kind of curious to sort of understand some of the ethos behind some of the ideas, particularly how it may relate to algorithmic culture. So there's this excerpt I've just taken out of it, which is fairly early on in the text. And it goes, so the potential of early text-based internet culture for countering repressive gender regimes, generating solidarity among marginalised groups, and creating new spaces for experimentation that ignited cyberfeminism in the 90s has clearly waned in the 21st century. The dominance of the visual in today's online interfaces has reinstated familiar modes of identity policing, power relations, and gender norms in self-representation. But this does not mean that cyber-feminist sensibilities belong to the past. Sorting the subversive possibilities from the oppressive ones latent in today's web requires a feminism sensitive to the insidious return of old power structures, yet savvy enough to know how to exploit the potential. Digital technologies are not separable from the material realities that underwrite them. They are connected so that each can be used to alter the other towards different ends. Rather than arguing for the primacy of the virtual over the material or the material over the virtual, xenofeminism grasps points of power and powerlessness in both to unfold this knowledge as effective interventions in our jointly composed reality. So I guess within this statement, what I'm kind of curious about to kind of understand is this kind of duality between the power and powerlessness and how that can relate into this sense of the virtual and the material forms. And so, because I guess I kind of see that as like a 0 and a 1, right? Like between those two things, and there's those oppositions there. And I guess I'm kind of interested in how within this manifesto, how you guys were sort of like thinking about those ideas, and maybe if it can be drawn into thinking about a 0 and a 1 within an algorithmic decision as well.
Wow, that's a massive question. Thank you, cool. All right, so with that passage that you read out there, I think the thing that we were really trying to intervene in was this tendency that you get in discussions around, especially the internet, and very particularly in critiques of gender politics from reactionary voices today, is this tendency to separate the virtual or the digital or the immaterial or the discursive from the material, which is supposed to be more real because it's concrete. So to see them as two separate regimes that aren't really interconnected, usually in order to use one to critique the other, and usually to kind of to see this in terms of materiality as being the more real. And you get this, like, for example, in this discourse, this turfy discourse about sex is material, therefore it's more real, whereas gender is constructed, it's discursive, it's representative, and therefore it's less real, and we can disregard it. Or it's like, you know, it's less important. So what we kind of, and I mean, this is not just about gender politics in the manifesto, we also talk about architecture, and the way that the home is constructed. But the point we're trying to make is that the virtual, or the digital, or the algorithmic, and the material are always entwined in a complex feedback loop. So you make interventions in the material world, they will flow into discourse, social construction, the way algorithms are created, into the use of the internet. And then the way that things get represented or played out there is not disconnected from the material world. It flows back into the material world and creates new technologies in response to things that people have imagined. The way that we represent ourselves online, I think, actually has a great bearing on how we then perform ourselves in material human relationships. There's like a lot of examples you can point to. So the idea is that it kind of makes no sense to separate these in any kind of hard dualism. In terms of zeros and ones, so this is a kind of trope from cyberfeminism, particularly used by Sadie Plant, who wrote this amazing book in 1997 called Zeros and Ones. What's the subtitle? Something like Feminism and the New Technoculture or something like this. And the way that she understood 0 and 1 functioning in this book and in cyberfeminism more generally is that 0 is like an unconstituted subject. It's the place that is, so this is a kind of non-essentialist description of gender. It's the place that's occupied by all of the things that aren't yet ones, that aren't yet fully formed subjects with agency and voice and visibility. And this includes in the book like women, machines, any kind of thing that is an infrastructure that the subjects then use to conduct their trade, their discussion, their politics. Which is why cyberfeminism kind of like connects women and machines together, because they're both not fully constituted subjects. And the constituted subject is like a human / a man, basically, for this kind of critique. But these are structural, not essentialist definitions. So the zero kind of has this the 0 and 1 in like an algorithmic decision they're like both sort of final values. It's like true or false, or this or that. It's a like empirical binary. It's this or it's this. But the 0 and 1 in cyberfeminism is kind of like the 0 can be anything because it's not yet formed. It's got like the potential to be like all of these different things. But the 1's kind of stuck because it's already stuck in the subject. So like, yeah, I think that's an interesting distinction to make, whereas the algorithm has just got this kind of hard binary, true or false. The 0 and 1 from cyberfeminism is about like the potential versus something that's already formed kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think that's, I guess, like for me personally, that was my like curiosity of wanting to enter into the algorithmic space, was really this like distinction between the 0 and the 1, but what the options are, I guess in between, but also before you reach the 1, which is that obviously that potential that you were talking about within that. And that's really what I get out of that whole xenofeminist manifesto, where it's like that everything feels like it's kind of got this like, obviously a political edge, but like an edge that kind of like is forcing its way into something and pushing through, and then it's kind of cracking doors open, but then it's not giving you those answers. It's kind of like using this material that we've already got and these kind of constructions that we've already got and like kind of demolishing them, but then sort of like pressing them back down into like a way of like rethinking what those things are.
Yeah, the thing with the Xenofeminist Manifesto is it's not like, here's a bunch of like doctrinal tenets that you need to now go and like execute. It's like, here's a structure for thinking about how to do politics and identifying these points of power and powerlessness that you're talking about. So it's kind of like, we call it an X on a mobile map at the end. It's this structure that you can apply to analyze a situation, then to figure out what to do, not a set of like pre-given political tenets.
Yeah.
Which I think was confusing for a lot of people who were like, well, what do we do now after reading it kind of thing. Yeah. But yeah, it's kind of like a structure or an architecture. Maybe you could go so far as to think about it as a kind of algorithm that you can deploy.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess that leads kind of nicely into sort of like thinking about, defining then this algorithmic space. So we kind of have this construction of how the movement or possibilities within those worlds, but then like how do we then like define what an algorithm is and what it could be and what it can look like as well. Maybe outside of like kind of the abstraction of those realities that we're talking about. So I guess I'm kind of like curious to have like your comments on what you think, maybe what I would say is the medium of the algorithm. Like, is it these social constructions and then how we kind of disperse them or something, or how we choose those different categories, or how we identify and how we move between them? Or is the medium itself more these mathematical or formulaic gestures?
I think that like there's a tendency to think about algorithms as like this cold, machinic, inhuman regime that's like purely mathematical, purely logical, and very inflexible, and somehow just like necessarily repressive because of that. Like, I think you sent me early on when we were kind of like swapping references, this article by Ian Bogost in The Atlantic or something, where he talks about I don't know, he's got like this kind of paragraph where he's talking about algorithms, and he's like, what if you just replace the word algorithm with God?
Yeah.
And that kind of represents the power of it and the way we relate to it. But I think that algorithms are really, again, to hark back to this idea that making this hard dualistic distinction between the digital and the material kind of locks you into these really rigid ways of thinking about things that back you into a corner and also deprive you of ways of analyzing power inequalities that are really important to still be able to have. What's my train of thought? So we get stuck in this kind of like critique of the algorithm. It's just inhuman and it's oppressing us. But I think if you think about what an algorithm is, it's like a set of instructions that you execute in a particular order and that you implement without really being concerned about the content that's coming out of them. Human societies have been employing algorithms since like the dawn of social relations. Algorithms are kind of like social technology. Every time, like a ritual is an algorithm, a series of instructions. Organized religion uses algorithms all the time. Governing your tribe or organizing the protocols of gift giving or transaction between different communities often uses algorithms. Writing a poem, poetic forms are often algorithmic. The pattern in the bathroom tiles in your bathroom is probably created by an algorithm. Like maybe someone's just done a pen and paper. So I think that thinking about algorithms in this hard, this hard dualistic way, whereas like they're inhuman and they're oppressive, is kind of a bad way to approach the problem, and it's much more interesting. And I think this is what your project is really doing, to think about how we're already entangled in algorithmic structures before you even start thinking about computers and mathematics. And then looking at, instead of like trying to find some untouched natural outside space of algorithms where you can go and like be free in nature or something like that, thinking about, okay, which algorithms are oppressive and which ones are emancipatory.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that, that really like lines up again super with, and you're right, where this project was going, where it's this super like investigation of what this could potentially look like to use algorithms, but outside of like, AI current structures, or maybe unpacking what is the basis of AI at the moment. And something that you passed on to me was Matteo Pasquinelli, is it? Pasquinelli?
Pasquinelli.
Pasquinelli, yeah. Just their work is incredible on like thinking about trauma and cybernetics and the way which the brain learns to rebuild. But they had a beautiful like kind of way of defining what an algorithm is for them. And part of that is like talking about like an algorithm is the division of the process into finite steps in order to perform and control it efficiently. But an algorithm is also a solution to a problem, an invention that bootstraps beyond the constraints of the situation. So an algorithm is a trick at the same time, which I really like that understanding of it. So it like, yes, it has this kind of serious element and this like, where like, yes, this is the formula, this is how you can then construct these ideas, how you can put things together, but then also at the same time, it's like a little magic trick. So it kind of has this like fallacy to it at the same time. It is doing something, but it's not the only answer to that problem.
I think sometimes some of the like most serious things can also be some of the funniest.
Yeah.
And I think that actually you maybe, I don't know whether you set out to do this from the beginning, but that this is something that the project has achieved. It's become incredibly funny by being extremely serious and imposing this logic.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to kind of speak about that a little bit, like whether you were aiming for that or that was something that emerged through the process.
Yeah, like I think part of my practice has always been very like austere and very serious. But the older I get and the more people that I meet, and like, especially living in Tasmania, I think that's been incredibly fruitful. It's learned to like then soften up at the same time, and like, or like, but then also maybe like amplify that seriousness so it becomes a bit like silly at the same time. So I kind of have suspected that that maybe get the case, and then also the artists that have been involved in the project too. Yeah, that it would get to that, but I guess I maybe always have this sense of like, oh yeah, it's real serious at the start, but then it just sort of falls apart. But to give people like an understanding of what the project is, and kind of now that we've kind of entered into this space, basically the work and the whole curatorial program has been to kind of, I've invited 4 artists who became ghost workers, who were learning how to facilitate or be a part of a show through a set of instructions, which the algorithm had determined what they would be doing and how they would be engaging with each other. And these artists basically just had a series of meetings together, and we would go through a series of tasks. As you do with an algorithm. An algorithm is just a set of formulas, and a process that you go through. So these 4 artists were just engaging with these various tasks and going through and unpacking certain ideas about the way in which they would think about the world. And the algorithm's focus and its kind of like final output was it's a language model for generating recommendations to a specific group of artists for a desirable mode of engagement within an exhibition that is explicitly determined by their perceptual differences and categorical relations. So it was really about trying to figure out these artists, what they're interested in, but then also who they are as people. Because as a curator, that's way more important for me, is who they are and their kind of like their energy or their personality and things like that. So there was definitely specific people who were like invited into the project who I know would attend to it with certain sensibilities, but then would also likely push up against me and break it in certain ways, but also had certain levels of silliness too. So I guess, yeah, that initial curation of the choosing those 4 artists, that's what I was like intended to do, to bring it back into that sort of like potential for really amazing things to happen, or it could just completely fall flat. Yeah, but it was a lot of trust, and those artists that were like involved in that project, I have so much love and respect for putting going through those motions, because some of the tasks were pretty crazy and obscure. Yeah. As well. And I think that, again, that is like part of the algorithmic world, where it kind of needs to be, just completely abstract, because there isn't a logic structure, or there is a logic structure, but it emerges from going through the process of the algorithm.
Yeah, this is something I kind of wanted to ask you about, like when designing algorithms, or when building an algorithm to create a model in artificial intelligence and computation. Usually, algorithms architecture can kind of fall on a spectrum between privileging top-down imposed properties. So like a human programmer will decide what parameters this algorithm needs to pull out. And then that will get checked by backpropagation at the end, where it'll be like, you succeeded in identifying a crosswalk and a traffic light, or every time you do a capture, you're doing backpropagation on an algorithm and telling it whether it has correctly identified what it thinks it's identified. And then there's algorithms on the other end that have emergent properties, where the actual parameters will be identified by the nodes in the net as they're going through the information and deciding on what things are going to be salient, rather than being told that by the programmer. So you've got kind of like this bottom-up possibility as well. And it's interesting because in in a social context, like algorithms are also ways of organizing groups of people, coordinating them, getting them to do something together, like create a show. And you've got these modes of pulling out salient information that are bottom-up or top-down, which are kind of like modes of governance. You can be really authoritarian and tyrannical, or you can be a bit more anarchist and let sort of things emerge of their own accord through self-organization. So we had a lot of discussions about this where you were like, I'm going to be really authoritarian. And then you're like, oh, actually, maybe not. Like, do you want to talk a little bit about where you ended up deciding to sit between those two extremes in terms of like how much you were going to dictate and make people fit into the structure and how much you were going to let things emerge of their own accord and like let the algorithm tolerate those additions?
Yeah, that's a interesting question because it definitely morphed and changed, you know, as we discussed over time. I guess initially, like kind of the impetus for using an algorithm was to also reduce the amount of work that the artist had to do in the first place. So I put a lot of effort in the start of the process in really designing all the instructions very clearly and carefully so that they would just attend the meeting, they would do the task. It was a supposedly simple task, and then that would be it. That would be their effort. So it was really about kind of my role in that point in time was really about trying to do as much as I could so that then the artist didn't have to do as many things. But what I realized from doing that is it kind of created two sort of folds where the algorithm like at one point got kind of too complex or something, or it was like kind of dealing with a logic that I had been so invested in and was forcing on these artists to try and figure it out. Like, because it made sense to me because I'd been thinking about it for months prior and had this weird, stupid logic going on in my head and was the game master, so to speak. So I could kind of like push, and I was just like, yeah, this is going to be easy for them. But then because they're all amazing people and super interesting and curious, but also very generous, they kind of push back up against that too. So there was then I realized that things had to change. But I also didn't want it to be like just a free-for-all. Yeah. Or like let's just have some nice discussions about algorithms, because there's plenty of that on Reddit or wherever, like you can go through and you can read that stuff. But I wanted to kind of put these people through the motions, test their capacities for doing it, but then also like try and approach it very softly to care for them.
Like a gentle algorithm.
Yeah, to try and be
and silly algorithm.
Yeah, to try and be gentle towards them, which is like, in terms of gentle, it's like reducing labor, but it's also like trying to make it clear enough that they could understand it. So it can be translated outside of my own little bubble, things like that. But also giving them the space to be able to be who they are as individuals. And as I was kind of going along, this was sort of working for a bit, but then I felt like maybe about meeting 3 or something, which was probably, I felt a little bit probably the most uncomfortable about that meeting because I hadn't done the work as much as I had previously. I felt like the algorithm then was starting to escape me. And it started to run away and do its own thing and started to go beyond my own comprehension of what the logic was. And I couldn't quite figure out where the end result was going to be. But then it was like, at that point, I knew I had to then, for me, put that effort in, but then also really restrict what the artist could do at that point. Give them less freedoms, and the task was a little bit more thorough, and the words were more specific, and I went a bit harder in the meetings in terms of making sure that they stuck to those tasks rather than giving them the freedom to kind of break it as much.
Did that like going a little bit extra hard on the like constraint and cracking the whip like actually produce a good result? Or
yeah,
I feel like
I think
just continuing with the kind of like free for all would have been.
I think it could have had the potential just for it to go anywhere, and then it's like, what's the point, right? Yeah. So if I gave them that little bit of extra freedom for those last few stages, they would have been able to kind of get to a point and then just like, oh yeah, but I'm just going to do this anyway.
Yeah.
but I really made it was like that whatever we got to at that end stage, that was it, that was the work. So as we kind of discussed, so part of the algorithmic process is each week they had to bring in what we call a universe object. And a universe object is kind of like something that represents these ideas that we've been talking about in terms of their perceptual capacities and what they've been looking at, what they're interested in. But it represented something that they could grade within the algorithmic structure. So because they were working through and looking at all these perceptual parameters that they were able to understand and the way in which they view the world, and they were bringing in objects that represented those ideas. And it's a universe object in the sense that it can completely bend space and time. So rather than being a world object that is grounded within our current understandings, it's like it's a whole universe in its sense. So they were bringing these objects in each week, and then we were kind of like unpacking and talking about these objects as we go through. I just lost where I was going with that. I was thinking, yeah, so then what I did with those, got them through those universe objects, that's the work that will actually be in the show. That's the art objects at the end of the day, will be these universe objects. And I did it at a point, I introduced the idea of that right at the very end of the meetings. So they were thinking they were working towards making it work, and then all of a sudden it was like stripped away, and then it was like, no, that universe object, that is your artwork. But that embodies your ideas that we've been working through for that. And I guess that kind of level of control and that gesture of stripping that away, not giving them the freedom to be able to then work on something carefully and curate it and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And it was interesting, as soon as I introduced that idea, there was panic. Like, as soon as these universe objects that had been so silly and like illogical, some of it, and weird relationships and stuff like that, then it was like, oh yeah, that's going to be the work in the exhibition. Everyone's like, what? Like, really? Like, and then they changed the way in which they then approached their development of the universe object, which I thought was very interesting. Yeah, but yeah, I guess like that was one of the ways in which I instigated those kind of levels of power or control.
I think I remember you saying after the last meeting that everyone was happy but confused.
Yeah.
But like what you did, I think, was really cool because you started off from these like individual people. Like you said, you wanted to look at each of the artists as an individual person. And you asked them to bring something out, like this universe object related to their own life, their own perception and interests, something that they were working on, like their scene that they were embedded in. So you've got these kind of like all of these particular experiences that begin with having no relationship to one another whatsoever. And then the algorithm is slowly putting them into a relationship. So you come out at the end with this kind of strange like community that's been created by every week thinking about relationships in this like this space that you've created to like tweak the parameters between the objects and relate them to one another. And that's what the exhibition is going to show at the end, what this strange community is when you create a collectivity out of a series of like discrete individuals. And one of the like other references that we kind of talked about early on was Matins' social dissonance. So like Matins, a experimental Spanish, kind of like began as a noise musician, and sort of hit like a wall with noise. Like was like, how do you get more transgressive? Felt like noise was getting a little bit formulaic, always the same tropes of transgression. And was like, well, where do you go from here? And ended up kind of looking at different forms of noise, like social noise, and was very interested in like, how do collectivities get created when we're all alienated under capitalism? It's kind of like Mattin's question. And I was like reading one of like his social dissonance work, which is sort of, it's not an algorithm, it's a score. It's like a set of instructions that the performer interprets with a group of people in a space. And the instruction notes are constantly saying, like, do not let the situation get cozy. It has to stay uncomfortable and alienating. And there's all of these tips for the interpreter of the score to keep everyone from not getting cozy. Like, don't let people sit on the floor. Because once they sit on the floor, they make like a little cozy nest. And I was thinking with this happy but confused kind of comment, like, you're doing a similar thing where you're taking a bunch of like discrete experiences, creating a collectivity, but it's not anti-cozy in the way that like Matins is. It kind of like found its own weird coziness at the end. And even though the collectivity that it produced is incredibly weird, and like I'm not going to put any spoilers out there, I'm really excited to see what it's going to like actually look like. But it's like, it kind of like ended up just being really lovely, I think. So I don't know if you wanted to talk about like this, like the kind of like overall affect of the piece and what it means to have like a collectivity that has these moments of pushing back and dissent and rebellion, but ends up being this kind of cohesive thing at the end. Like, do you think that that's something that's intrinsic to the way the algorithm functions, putting things into this relation? Do you think that if you ran it with a group of different participants who maybe didn't know each other, I think your participants sort of at least knew each other a little, like would it be different? How do you adjust the coziness parameter on your algorithm?
And I think it quite unexpectedly got to that space. Like I thought that they'd go through these gestures, they'd have a good time and a bit of silliness, but I didn't think that they would bond in such a way and actually develop this very unique language that only really made sense between them. Because what they were, part of the process of what they were going through was they would have their universe objects, they were talking about the various categories that those universe objects were in, but then they would be trying to map their universe object to another person's category, essentially. And through that process, they had to make things that made sense in kind of very obscure ways. So as an example, we had one week there was a wasp nest, and the artist was trying to figure out what the constipation levels were of the wasp nest, because someone had to, one of the artists, their parameter was constipation level. So it was like, how do you kind of think about this idea of a wasp nest being constipated? And where do you grade that on a scale between 0 and 1? And what is that scale as well? But I think, like through those interactions and a combination of the artist being involved, being obviously incredible and super generous, that they facilitated that, because they could have gone the other way. And I feel like if I did it with a different group of people, it would have been a very different dynamic. But I think the advantage of using algorithms in any kind of form, but particularly within curation, because it is so regimented and it is going through a process and it does not care about what the outcome is, as long as it achieves that end outcome. But even if it doesn't, it kind of just gives up, right? So there's kind of like, there's no non-care or something associated with that. But because it is so regimented, it allows the people that are involved in the algorithm the freedom and the movement to move around it and to have that flexibility, because also it gives them a sense of, yes, the job will be done. Yeah. We will reach that one eventually. We will get to that conclusion as long as we just kind of go through the tasks. And if we don't, the algorithm doesn't care, but so then I don't care too. So, but then they kind of, are able to bond over that. So I think I would really love to do it again with a different group of people and do it for a very long period of time. I think that could be super interesting, although it'd be very bizarre after a long period. But I feel like because it is going through these tasks, it does bring out those individuals personalities super clearly. And what we ended up with at the end is like exactly what I would expect from all of those individuals. Like, it was actually so crazy. It was like, and even because the idea of the algorithm too was to kind of unravel the way in which they would all engage with each other, which is why I picked people who were very close to me so I could see that. They were kind of like the reference point. I know how that they engage with work. I know how that they engage with their ideas, but I also know their sensibilities towards care for other people as well. So it was a monitoring of that as we were going through. But yeah, there was one point in the final meeting where one of the artists, their final gesture was just like exactly what I would expect from them. But it also it worked. Like the whole algorithm worked, and it kind of all unfolded and then just was flattened into this beautiful space of these 4 people and working together. Yeah, and for me that was super humbling to be able to, and so exciting, but you can feel it in the gestures as you go through and within those conversations. So yeah, forever like thankful to all of those artists involved. And their beautiful attention to the kind of the absurdity of the process. Yeah.
There's this kind of like, I don't know, discourse about like algorithms, especially neural nets, like being black boxed and having this kind of strange logic that we don't really understand and we can't reverse engineer. No one knows like what thought processes are going on inside. But what this project kind of does is it unblack boxes it, and it shows the like absolute weirdness of the logic as it's creating the final output. And like, yeah, like you've documented all of this process as well, which I think is like one of the really interesting parts of the process. The fact that you have this record of how these particular decisions were made, and a document of the care and the attention and the time given and the generosity. So yeah. I wanted to ask though, what about, so I know that you also fed into the algorithm the rubric for the like institutional expectations of CAT.
Yeah.
To make sure that the exhibition like ticked all of the boxes that CAT needs to get the funding and all of that stuff. Yeah. So do you want to like, I don't know, like talk about how that affected the process, like feeding the
definitely
the institutional constraints into the process?
Yeah, that was a very funny one, a very funny meeting. As a curator, what I'm interested in is being a wall between the institutional space and the artists. But in a wall in the sense that I can pass on messages, you know, it's not completely...
Like a protective
But
wall.
it's protective, yeah, and it's caring so that they can facilitate their ideas and that the artist can, but it also, you know, ticks the box of the institution. And that probably means me doing that little bit of extra like administration work to keep the institution happy, but then also to make sure that the artists are still kind of constrained within the gallery, kind of what it's looking for. So one of the tasks as part of the meeting was I got the gallery rubrics and I got them to grade their universe objects on the rubrics where it would sit. And you have things like what is the audience, you know, level, what is the kind of experimentation, the rigor, things like that. And they all went through and then marked it, and then we averaged those scores. It got quite a low score. I think it was like like as a show, it would have only been about a 14 or something, or a 13 out of like 25 as its score. So it just sat right bang in the middle. It'd be a very average show, all up. But then the funny side of it was then the artists were then starting to push against the rubrics a lot. And then they were all talking about grading the rubrics as part of and being another universe object within this sphere. So it kind of gave them a little bit of, something to push up against within the gallery and the institutional structures, but it also then tamed them a little bit, because then they were starting to become aware that this was going to be an exhibition and it had to have certain levels of audience, right? So I think something in the rubrics is like, does it meet a wider audience outside of, like the kind of gallery area or something like that? And for a lot of them, it didn't, because they hadn't shared any of their universe objects. So then they had to think about, how are we going to share these universe objects to a wider audience? Is it possible? Things like that. And they went through a transformative process to their universe objects to try and consider that. Which changed the way that they, again, thought about that process. We haven't done the final meeting, which is a revision, and part of that final meeting will be grading the whole show as a group. So, and then I'll hand that to CAT, and they can pass that off to the board or whatever.
So it kind of produces its own paperwork as it's going along. It takes the administrative strain off the CAT.
Definitely. And the same thing kind of applies to sort of even the artist statements and how we will talk about the work. Because it's a language model, part of it is like, yes, telling the artists what to do, how they're engaging with each other, but the other side is a verification system. So that logic that they've constructed is a verification of why these objects are in the gallery, and it will also determine exactly what's on the artist statement, things like that, so that the artist doesn't even need to think about that side of things too. And then the gallery has that justification for those objects.
Are you going to package this up and sell it to art galleries all around the world?
Yeah, I was thinking of putting it on eBay for like $50 or something. And even just because I've been doing things of selling tickets to shows, really expensive prices on eBay, but putting the QR code on eBay. So I think I'll do the same thing, where it'll just be a little QR code and people can scan it and then they can use it for the show. But I'd love to try it out for in a different gallery context, and also with different artists and different people and things like that, and see. And for other people to facilitate it as well would be super amazing. And it's all there, and it's all constructed. They just have to go through the tasks. So, we'll see. See if anyone buys it.
We'll do a corporate presentation, travel around, go see the board.
An infomercial style. I think that's pretty good. Maybe probably ended up in a weird space, but could open it up to questions. Yeah.